It's my distinct pleasure today to be able to moderate our two very distinguished panels and discussions this morning. As Senator Nunn noted in his opening remarks, the purpose today is not so much to offer detailed discussions about fracking, advantages or disadvantages of fracking, or U.S. LNG exports, as much as to take a big picture look at some of the changing dimensions to the global gas landscape and how those changes resonate here in the Southeast region, which is rapidly becoming a rising consumer region of gas in the country. And to do so, what we're going to do today is take both a sort of top-down look and look at how the international and global dimensions of these challenges resonate here in the region, but also a bottom-up look, and particularly how two revolutions are intersecting. That of the information and that of the energy revolutions are intersecting, and some of the challenges, trends, and opportunities that that intersection affords that are really burgeoning out of some of the research here going on in the Southeast, and especially here at Georgia Tech. So there are really two sets of questions that we're going to be looking at in these two sessions this morning. One is, how do shifts in global supply and demand and the changing infrastructure of natural gas create new opportunities and challenges for U.S. economic and strategic competitiveness, and how, again, does that resonate here in the Southeast region? And the other set of questions have to do with what are the efficiency, resilience, competitiveness, cybersecurity issues attendant to that intersection between the information and energy infrastructures. So in light of those two sort of basic sets of questions, we have two sets of panels that begin to scope out some of those issues. So I'm very proud to be able to host this first panel, or moderate this first panel, and introduce our first speaker, who's going to give us an overview on some of those geopolitical challenges, trends, and opportunities. And that is Ms. Sarah Ladislaw. Sarah is the Director and Senior Fellow of the Energy and National Security Program at CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where her research and policy analysis focuses on the geopolitics of energy, energy security, energy technology, and climate change. Sarah has done stints at DOE, and was a Presidential Management Fellow, so for those of you students who are interested in those programs, this is someone to emulate in that regard, and she currently teaches courses on energy at George Washington University. And as I mentioned, Sarah's going to come up here and talk to us a little bit about setting the scene about this geopolitical dimension to natural gas. Sarah?
Great. Thank you very much. I love it when a plan comes together. Hi, my name is Sarah Ladislaw. Thanks for the kind introduction. It is exceptionally daunting to follow both Senator Nunn and Secretary Moniz after such great comprehensive remarks about the energy challenges that are before us. I'm really pleased to be part of this panel and very happy that Adam asked for me to focus on something we just actually last week completed a big study on, which is the geopolitical implications of the energy revolution taking place in the United States. As you can imagine, you know, the world is sort of watching what's happening in the U.S. Even the most seasoned energy observers, myself included, would never have guessed that a production surge both on the natural gas and the oil side would ever sort of take place over such a short period of time. And they've got big questions. They've got questions about what it means for the United States' place in the world, what it means for our energy policy, our commitment to our climate change challenge, but also how will this resource trend proliferate around the world in a positive sense? Will it be as fast, as big? How long? What will the impacts be? And you know, before sort of going through a very quick overview of some of the issues that we discovered in a year-long study of what the geopolitical and national security impacts were of this unconventional revolution, I will, you know, just say this is fast. These are early days, and I know it seems like we have very large numbers that we're throwing out in terms of overall production, overall resource base size, but when you think about when this is really sort of, you know, got up and running on the gas side, 2007, 2008, and then the tight oil side much more recently, these are very, very early days for understanding the resource base and what it's going to do. And so I think that theme, while some other folks on the panel will be able to talk about that more in depth, really sort of reverberates through the geopolitical sphere in the idea that perception of what this change is really leading reality. And it's sort of shaping the way that people are thinking about some of these trends. And so that's what I'm going to spend a little bit of time focusing on in my remarks. We looked at oil and gas together, so I won't separate them, but happy to sort of talk about sort of the discrete natural gas impacts as part of the discussion. Sorry. So this is a presentation, as I said, about how this remarkable oil and gas production surge in the United States is impacting energy, geopolitical, and national security issues. This chart represents U.S. oil and gas production by type, and the bars from left to right represent Alaska, offshore, onshore, and unconventional oil and gas production. As you can see, U.S. tight oil and shale gas production, which is represented by that far bar over on the far right-hand side, grew from about 4% of total U.S. production in 2005 to 42% today, and it's projected to reach almost 51% by 2030. The magnitude of this production surge is historically significant. On this chart, the bars represent annual oil production increases in a given country for a given year. The U.S. oil production increase in 2013 alone is the 6th largest annual increase of any country ever. Saudi Arabia holds the top 5 spots. And as you'll see, the U.S. production surge in the United States in 2012 makes the top 9. The U.S. is now the largest oil and gas producer in the world. This chart shows oil and gas production in Russia, the United States, and Saudi Arabia. The U.S. is now a bigger oil and gas producer than Russia, seen in red, and Saudi Arabia, shown by the green bar. But unlike those two countries, however, much of what is produced in the United States is consumed here, so we'll never become sort of on par with the net exporting capabilities of these countries. This production surge has contributed to a new energy posture for the United States, making the country stronger and reducing certain strategic vulnerabilities. It contributes to U.S. strength by improving U.S. near-term economic vitality. This chart shows the results of one study done by the Rhodium Group, which concluded that the oil and gas production surge, shown here in red, is projected to add more jobs and raise GDP higher than did the 2009 economic stimulus package, shown here in blue. This new energy posture also reduces U.S. vulnerability by contributing supply to global markets and reduces U.S. dependence on imported oil and gas. On this screen are the world's major energy consumers. The bubbles represent the size of total energy consumption in a given country or region. The vertical axis represents the percentage of natural gas that each country imports, and the horizontal axis represents the percentage of oil imported by each country. As you can see, all countries were growing more import dependent for both oil and gas until 2005. That same year, the U.S. reverses course. It has already reduced oil imports and can soon be a net exporter of gas. Notice China's energy consumption continues to grow and it becomes more import dependent, whereas Japan's energy consumption doesn't grow as robustly, but it sort of occupies that far right-hand corner of high dependence on both oil and gas for imports. Let's watch it through just one more time, because the bubbles move kind of fast. While the United States will remain inextricably linked to global markets, it's important to note that it will now participate more fully as both an exporter and an importer of oil and gas resources. So the new U.S. posture accentuates the pre-existing shift to a rapidly rising Asia and amplifies the tensions inherent in that shift. This chart shows the precipitous rise in Asian energy demand relative to other regions between 2011 and 2035. Now these circles, they all represent energy consumption, total energy use in each region measured in quadrillion British thermal units. In the coming years, more and more energy trade will shift to meet Asian demand. This shift intensifies competition among Asian consumers and raises the stakes for producers like the Middle East, Central Asia, and Russia, who all want to access Asian markets. There's no reason to believe that this shift has to lead to conflict. Energy trade ties can serve as incentive to avoid tension and instability. This map shows oil and gas trade flows into China by region. For example, that blue line represents all oil and gas imports from Russia and Central Asia. The Middle East, represented here by the green line, is the largest supplier of oil to China. So China is treading very carefully to balance its relationship with two of the Middle East's major oil producers, Saudi Arabia and Iran. On this next slide, you see Russia, a major exporter of oil and gas. Russia is pursuing an energy export strategy that is aimed at balancing interests among competing Asian consumers, its new market, target, and its traditional European market. As a result of the new U.S. energy posture, some projections say that the U.S. oil imports from the Middle East may drop by 80% by 2025. Not only is the Middle East one of the largest oil-producing regions of the world, but these dots on the map indicate vital choke points through which a huge amount of oil passes each day. For example, right now, nearly 40% of globally traded oil passes through the Strait of Hormuz. The U.S. has long maintained a military presence in the region as part of a visible symbol to its commitment to ensuring the free flow of oil and other commerce in the region. Falling U.S. oil imports help feed the concern that the U.S. is distancing itself from the Middle East. As a result, the U.S. is redoubling its efforts to shore up its relationships and reassure countries of its sustained commitment. The U.S. production surge has also changed economic realities and perceptions for both companies and countries. This chart shows the wide difference in natural gas prices around the world. Low natural gas prices are creating a competitive advantage for some U.S. industries and are shifting investment away from other regions of the world. On the oil side, the onset of tight oil production has put downward pressure on prices that has forestalled oil price escalation during a time of significant supply outages and may contribute to slack markets going forward. Greater supply of oil and gas is generally good news for energy consumers in the global economy. For major consumers and oil and gas importers like China, Europe, and Japan, extra supply has made positive contributions to their security and diversity of supply, though it has not solved their energy security concerns. For China, unconventionals have helped dampen a U.S. in decline narrative and foster greater U.S.-China energy cooperation. Unconventionals have also exacerbated competitiveness concerns for the EU and Japan, put pressure on EU's green agenda, and have done little to alleviate concerns with their unpredictable suppliers. This trend also complicates some of the already tense inter-Asian competition dynamics. The rapid rise of unconventionals also puts pressure on global oil and gas producers to be more competitive. For big producers like Russia and Saudi Arabia, unconventionals reinforce the shift to Asia. They added pressure to reform in Russia and complicate Saudi Arabia's position as a market balancer. For reentrants like Iran, Iraq, and Mexico, unconventionals raise the stakes for market reentry, place pressure on OPEC cohesion, and add to internal pressure for reform. For revenue dependents like Algeria, Nigeria, and Venezuela, the potential for slack markets raises risks of instability. The rapid onset of this new energy trend and the complex nature of its impacts on the rest of the world have contributed to an environment in which perception is leading reality. The U.S. production surge has given the United States a new energy posture. It has accelerated certain geopolitical trends and exacerbated some geopolitical conditions. And it has influenced perceptions of U.S. national security in subtle but important ways. One of the main questions is how the United States seeks to utilize its newfound energy position. How policymakers will respond is not yet clear. So far, perceived inconsistencies in U.S. statement or between U.S. words and actions help fuel perception that the U.S. place in the world has changed or will change in the future. For example, the U.S. says it's committed to its relationship in the Middle East, but others point to a greater U.S. focus on Asia, weakening energy trade relationships and military budget cuts, and note the resulting anxiety throughout the region. The U.S. says that it's for free trade in energy, but perceived U.S. reluctance to export natural gas and crude oil is perceived as the United States trying to capture greater economic advantage at home or to gain leverage in ongoing trade negotiations. The U.S. says energy is not a weapon, but statements crediting the new U.S. energy posture as enhancing its ability to place sanctions on Iran or contribute to some solution to the Ukraine crisis raises fears that the U.S. will use energy as leverage in foreign policy. The U.S. says that it's committed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but there is a fear that the abundant oil and gas might lead the U.S. to abandon, extend, or drag its feet on the timeline for its climate change goals. The truth is that these are early days for the development of this energy trend, and both policy and market responses are still being developed. But in a time of great uncertainty where perception is leading reality, the possibility for misunderstandings abound. Thus far, it's pretty clear that this newfound energy development makes an important economic contribution to the U.S. and a variety of other countries around the world. The new energy posture does not fundamentally alter the U.S. place in the world, but it has contributed to other countries' perceptions of changing U.S. interests and fostered a widespread reevaluation of the geopolitical balance in the energy space. More than anything else, the uncertainty about the future direction of unconventional oil and gas development, on top of a very fluid geopolitical atmosphere, necessitates a flexible, adaptable, and stability-oriented strategy. Clarity of purpose and intention, especially from a global leader like the United States, is important, especially with regard to our governance of these newfound energy resources. Going forward, this uncertain energy reality requires flexibility on the policymakers' part, hopefully resulting in an approach that leads everyone to seek greater stability rather than leverage. So, some opening comments just to get the discussion going. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. And so now let's turn to our first panel, and I'm very pleased to be able to introduce our first commentator, His Excellency Elin Suleymanov, the Ambassador of the Republic of Azerbaijan to the United States. Ambassador Suleymanov is no stranger to the United States. He served as Consul General in Los Angeles. He also got his degree in the law and diplomacy at the Fletcher School in Boston. In light of recent events in Europe and across Eurasia, and especially regarding U.S. policy priorities and in these changes, I can think of really no one better at this moment to talk to us about some of those changing trends in Eurasia. So please.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, it's a great honor to be on a panel like this, which is much more informed than I am. You will see my map is very simple. There will be no sophistication there. But then at the same time, all we want is to turn safely and securely supply diversified supplies to Europe. So that kind of makes it easy. I also wanted to thank everybody here for organizing the great event. Thank you very much, Mr. Stulberg, for making all this happen and for your kind invitation. It was a great honor to be present at the presentation of Secretary Moniz. I want to thank Mr. Nunn, Senator, for being the great leader you have been and also for putting this all together. I'm actually very impressed and somewhat intimidated to be in your presence because you've done so much moving all this weapons of mass destruction in and out of these places, so it's actually quite impressive. So I have to say thank you for all your great service, and it's good to be here. Mr. Bankov, thank you very much for what you've done. And I have to say that I actually have two things I wanted to point out. First of all, apparently the Embassy of Azerbaijan has made the right choice by banking with the Bank of America, which is a good thing. Now I know they have a strategic vision. They told me I didn't realize it fully, but now I see it. And the second thing, it's good to be in Atlanta because you may not know that, but first time when Azerbaijan actually competed in the Olympics under its own independent flag, the first gold medal we got in Atlanta, it was right here. It was in wrestling. So now, impressed by that, Azerbaijan is trying to hold the first ever European Olympics in Azerbaijan in 2015. So that's a good thing. You're all welcome to participate. As we talk about, on the subject, as we talk more about energy security in Europe, I'll take you a little bit outside the United States. But just as Secretary Moniz pointed out very correctly today, energy security of allies of the United States is a national security matter for the United States of America. And it is a national security matter for the rest of the world. We cannot abandon and ignore the situation in Europe because today what we could see is that the lack of diversified, reliable supplies of energy to European markets creates a situation when energy security translates, or lack of thereof, or doubts about energy security translate in a certain political and policy decisions. So the battlefield is clearly all around how to make those supplies diversified. So there's a lot of discussion now. We've seen right on the map how American markets could help, how American new gas can come, and perhaps LNG or an American supplies would be a solution to the European crisis. Well, first of all, let me put it this way. The more diverse supplies come to European market, the better it is. However, first of all, as we discussed as well, and as Mr. Ladislaw pointed out so eloquently, LNG is an expensive product. So the most attractive markets for that are in Asia. So in fact, if you do put them on the open market, they try to gravitate towards Asian markets. That's one. Second, they require enormous infrastructure. There's also a lag time, so we're only in the beginning of the discussion on how to make that happen. So all those factors coming together create certain questions about how it's going to move forward, whether it's actually going to happen. Now, in this particular case, the only new volumes of gas, natural gas, coming into European markets are brought by the southern gas corridor, which originates from the Azerbaijani field, Shah Deniz 2. Now, this is an important thing to remember. We have a lot of discussion today, also in Washington and elsewhere, and in Brussels, about how to supply gas to the nations which are starved in Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, which are starved from the gas, which need gas, which are starving for gas, for new supplies. Most of those discussions talk about reversing the existing flows of gas. I mean, when people tell we'll reverse this pipeline, we'll do that, we will bring a little bit of that gas into the market. In reality, all of those discussions talk about gas which is already there, not new, which is already committed, not new supplies of gas. The new supplies of gas, there's only one pipe. The only one source at the moment which is shovel-ready, which is moving forward, and that is the Southern Corridor. Now, why it's important? Southern Corridor and the financial investment decision, the final investment decision on that, was made in Azerbaijan, in Baku, Azerbaijan, on December 17th last year, in 2013, quite timely, as it turns out. So the pipeline consists, it's actually three pipelines. It's Southern Caucasus pipeline, which is Azerbaijan, Georgia, then it goes to Turkey to Trans-Anatolian pipeline, which is a TANAP. It's a major dedicated pipeline. And then the decision was made to make it to Trans-Adriatic pipeline, to bring it to Greece, Albania, to Italy. Now, there was also a discussion of possibly going into Eastern Europe, and now we're talking about interconnected. So very realistically, today we're talking about 1 BCM going from the Southern Corridor north into Bulgaria. So Bulgaria becomes part of this discussion, and it's right there now. So it's transiting about 7 countries, 6 regulatory systems, 4 separate commercial projects, 11 companies, $45 billion, and with gas contracts to 11 companies. This is a very serious, large production. Now, it's also scalable, which is very important as well. Now, as you understand, I stand in a city of Atlanta, in the capital of the state of Georgia. Now, whenever we talk about energy in Georgia, Azerbaijan is always present. Of course, that's a different Georgia because Azerbaijan is the largest taxpayer and an investor in Georgia. Now, these are very important issues because what happens today is that the final investment decision in Azerbaijan in December showed the readiness of the European nations to move forward with preparing for the next, for economic growth in Europe. They have confidence in the future of European markets. In fact, we have confidence in the European markets. That's why, for instance, since the crisis of the Eurozone, the Southern Corridor project is the first planned major-scale investment in Greece and Albania. Now, it's not a grant. It's not a subsidy. It's not a loan. It's actual full-time commitment and investment with the looking for the future. Now, why is it happening? Azerbaijan builds on a previous success of the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline, now, which is an oil pipeline, and I know Senator Nunn was, I believe, in the Senate when it all happened, and when it was beginning, it was a very important project which actually changed the map of Mediterranean region and added to energy security of Europe to adding new diverse supplies. In fact, one of the peculiar parts of that pipeline is that it provides about 40% of Israel's oil supply. Now, what it did at that point, it connected as a Caspian, Black, and Mediterranean. So it created a Mediterranean region for us. It made Caucasus a Mediterranean region. Today, what we have, we create a new geography. Look at this. This is no longer a ghetto of post-Soviet states. It's no longer this dependency of the same strange countries which are always doomed to being unstable. And if something happens, if something goes down, if someone invades each other, that's okay because they are like that, they're different. Well, we're no longer there. We're no longer different. We don't want to be in that ghetto. So what we look about is building partnership which create new region and we become a full-fledged members of Southern European community. Now, I was actually called today, Secretary Moniz mentioned Kazakhstan when we spoke here, and it's not surprising. Kazakhstan is a major producer and holder of reserves. And in fact, Azerbaijan is not the largest holder, or neither the largest producer of oil and gas. So why, when you talk about energy security, why, when you talk about Southern Corridor and the Europeans focus on this corridor, why does everybody talk about Azerbaijan? And I tell you something, it's not just reserves. It's not just production. It's not what you have, but how you use it, which I think is the most important thing. Because Azerbaijan, from the very beginning of its independence, has pursued a policy of making sure that we connect directly to our consumers in Europe. We want to sell gas to Europe. It's a strategic decision. I'll give you this. If you look at the map, you would see that Azerbaijan, which is the only country in the world which borders both Russia and Iran, both major producers, could have easily sold our gas to the border of Russia or to the border of Iran without any additional requirement for major infrastructure and a much better price without losing any money on investment. Trust me, our coffers would be much, much richer than they are today. The reason we don't do that is because Azerbaijan believes in direct relationship. We're not talking about competing with Russia. Our volumes are not sufficient to do that, it's obvious. Nor anybody is talking about confronting or replacing the Russian gas. What we're talking about is adding diversity to the markets which are dominated by very few producers. In fact, in many cases, by one producer. And what happens then, through diversity, we have some more security added to the market, which I think is a very important aspect here. Now, on my last point, we always talk about how that matters to the United States. What can the United States do? In the success of the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline shows that over the 10 years between 1996 and 2006, when the project was conceived and then completed, it was very much dependent on full political support from the United States. Presidents Clinton and George W. Bush, both administrations, sectors of energy, they all had a significant participation in that. Why it matters? Only a project which is seen as a consistent commitment of the United States of America over long term can succeed in our part of the world. Short-term projects, inconsistencies do not help. What happens, these are long-term projects, they're long-term investments. In order to succeed, they go to many countries, they bring prosperity, they link people together, they link countries together. But for them to succeed, people who participate in them and people who do not want those projects to succeed, they need to know that there is a full-time commitment of the United States to that. Now, when I say full-time political commitment, Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline did not require any American financial assistance, nor, of course, did it ever require any American boots on the ground. Those are out of the question. What we talk about is making sure that the United States is interested and understands the strategic value of that and tells its allies what the strategic value of a project is. So at this, I think I should stop and let the other panelists continue. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Our next commentator is Mr. Raoul LeBlanc, who is the Managing Director of Global Gas at PFC Energy. Mr. LeBlanc brings a wealth of private sector experience in the petroleum industry, as well as an international affairs degree. And Mr. LeBlanc is going to talk a little bit about what's going on here in North American gas.
Right. Thank you very much. me get fired up here. I'm going to try to keep up with Sarah a little bit. I have a couple of slides I'm going to talk about first, and then I want to show you a real live example of how some of these things work in the real world. So what I want to do first, though, is I would like to go ahead and, wait a minute, there we go. All right, we should be up. All right. And bam. Okay. So I want to cover three things in this. One, why is this a big deal? As she has duly pointed out, it's a big deal. Two, what's the status of this revolution? Where are we? And then how long might it last? And then what are the implications for consumers? I'm going to go pretty fast here. We have a lot of things I'd like to cover. So the first thing I want to do is I live in Texas now. I'm not from Texas. I'm from Louisiana. But I want to start, of course, with cows. If you add all the cows in the world, the biomass of all those cows is about 520 million tons. Okay? If I add the biomass of the sheep and goats, I'm at 105. And if I add the biomass of the chickens, I'm at 48. Now, here's the quiz part. Okay? Yell out answers, please. If you add the biomass of all the ants in the world, what is the number? We need some numbers. I got to have 3 at least before I can move on. Go ahead. 500. Anybody else? Come on. Billion. 742. The correct answer is 5,000. Okay? Now, why am I talking about ants and cows and chickens? I'm talking about ants, cows, and chickens because I'm making a point, which is that nature has distributed hydrocarbons, oil and gas resources, in much the same way. If you have a resource that's dispersed over a wide area, okay, it's usually going to be much larger. Okay. So in the history of oil for the last 120 years and gas, we have generally been focused on this. It's the easiest to produce, it's the cheapest to produce. As we move down here, we get much, much larger resources. So first thing I want to point out is that for unconventional resources, we have tapped into something that's difficult and expensive, but it is incredibly large. Next point, just to continue with my old ant analogy. So if you decide that you are going to live on ants by eating them one at a time, what will happen to you? You will die. Thank you very much. You will die because when you bend down to pick them up, okay, the energy you expend picking them up is less than the energy you get doing that. Now, why is that important? That's important because all of unconventional oil and gas is situated around the issue of tight rock. What it means is as I drill down, 7, 8, 10,000 feet, I hit a pay zone down here. That will drain a radius around the wellbore. Now, the rock in certain reservoirs is very tight. It's tighter than the concrete on the sidewalk, okay? And so imagine you're trying to get something through the sidewalk, okay? So as a result, you spend a lot of money going down for very, very little, okay? Now, and so you wind up developing too many wells and you don't make any money. Now, see if anybody's got their thinking cap on. What is the solution? Well, to the ant problem. It's the anteater, okay? So, the point is, anteater goes horizontally, okay, and has actually a very special material on its tongue that allows it to get a whole lot of ants. Same thing with horizontal drilling. I go down and I drill horizontally. I contact a very large portion of the reservoir per the ratio of the vertical that I drilled, and I'm able to get a lot of volumetric drainage from the reservoir, okay? So that's what we've done. Now, the point I want to leave you with is that, particularly if you use pad drilling, it limits the surface impact. The point I want to leave you with, though, is really important. We've tapped into this large resource because prices allowed us to try lots of crazy things, and some of them work, okay? And that meant that we were able to tap these resources. So high prices and technology allowed us to do this. Now, where are we in the revolution? So when you look at the way that, this is sort of industry parlance, but the way that the industry describes all these the revolution is it breaks it down into what are called plays. A play is just a name for a group of wells which are all tapping a certain reservoir underneath the earth, a certain strata of rock. These are the major plays that you'll sometimes hear about if you follow the oil and gas unconventional revolution. The only thing I want to point out is that plays pass through some important life stages. You can see them down here. From this proving stage, which is about 100 wells long, and on to an optimization phase, which lasts about 1,000 to 1,500 wells. Most of the plays that are generating the backbone growth that we're seeing in the marketplace these days are plays that are in a standardization phase. Okay? These can last anywhere from, usually in the smaller plays, you may have 20,000 wells to be drilled. In the larger plays, you may have 70, 80, 100,000 wells to be drilled. Okay? So I always say that this phase is like college graduation. Okay? Okay, we put a lot of money into you. Okay? Now go out and for the next 40 years, see what you can do. Okay? There's still a lot of, notice, the other thing I want to point out about this is that this is gassy on the bottom and oily up top, right? We're doing this for both gas and oil. Interestingly, we are not right now trying to de-risk any new gas plays because the gas price is too low, the risk reward is not appropriate, so we've abandoned those right now. If the gas price were to go back up to a very high number, $7, $8, we will find more of these. We are trying to de-risk quite a number of oil plays because the oil price is sufficient to incentivize us to do this. And if I take a look at some of these trajectories of the production, I can see that you've had 3 plays that have really gone from nothing. Within 3 years, 3 to 4 years, they've gone to 1.2 million barrels a day. Okay? Now, I want to take a second here, and I want to examine this one play called the Haynesville. It's this gray line, which has now come back down. And I want to show you a couple of important things about how plays work. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you this. And let's see if I can get this going. Sorry, I lost my... All right. This is a map, and you'll see that this is northern Louisiana. Okay, there. We're closest it's the closest major play to Georgia I could find. So, all right. Now, what I want to point out is here I'm going to make a couple of key points. These points apply to all of the unconventional plays, and they're just things I think they're important to know. What you're looking at here is about 3,000 wells, and we've situated these wells and colored them. It's a heat map, and the best wells are the top quintile, then the second best, third best, fourth best, and fifth best. Okay? These are 20% each one. The point I want to make is you can tell there's a pretty strong spatial pattern. Okay? So all of these plays have sweet spots. Okay? In other words, places where it's much, much better to be. So if somebody was going to, if you were going to be able to pick acreage in this play, clearly you would pick this. Okay? And then you can look, the second point I'll make is that the companies that are generally developing these are companies that you probably haven't heard of. They don't sell gasoline, they don't make power, they don't sell you natural gas. Chesapeake is one of the largest. You can see it actually missed a lot of the sweet spot. You have another company in Canada has a big position there. XCO has a fabulous position there. And there's a couple of people that are important in this play. All right. So it's mainly also done by people you haven't heard of. The third point I want to make is that, well, okay, how much better is, say, one of these wells, right, versus one of these wells? And the answer is, here, I'll show you the curves. The curves look like this. So if I get a top quintile well, ignore the first month, it's a partial month, so I get a peak production of around 13.3 million cubic feet a day. Meanwhile, if I'm drilling down here, I'm getting 4. So the point is, in these plays, there's a wide distribution, okay, and it matters a lot. In general, these wells are money losers, okay, for the companies that are drilling them, all right? And these plays are winners, okay? And so there's a big mix of winners and losers. The last point I want to make is that, play a little movie here. What I'm going to do is show these over time, okay? And so we'll step through time. As a well was drilled, it will appear, and then after a year, it will disappear. So it's got a 12-month rolling snapshot. And take a look. This is the early part of the play, and you can see people are trying to find. Nobody knows where the sweet spot is, okay? They just don't know. It's a lot of risk. And so they're drilling everywhere, okay? And then you'll see, right, they start to fill in the play. Then watch what happens. Let me see, we're in 2010 here still. Now the gas price is starting to fall at this point. And as the gas price falls, and what happens is people start losing money in this play. And watch this as activity contracts. Activity, by the way, in this play fell from 180 rigs to about 40. Okay? Huge drop, more than 75%. Now watch what happens though as activity contracts here in 2012 and 2013. What you can see is people leave the better parts of the worst parts of the play, and they're focusing more and more, to the degree they have acreage, in the better parts. All right? So this is the last point I want to make about these kinds of plays, which is that I like the analogy, just to make it a little extreme, is in the pantry that we're eating from, we have power bars and popcorn. Okay? You have some good wells and some bad wells. Right now we're eating the power bars. Okay? Now, there's a lot of wells in this area to be drilled, about 20,000. But we reckon that only about 500 will qualify as top quintile. Is that a tragedy? Is it a crisis? No. But it does mean that in the future, we will have to migrate out of some of the better portions of the play and start to utilize some of the worst portions of the play. Okay? Leading to some price pressure. Now, let's go back to talk about consumers. In our view, consumers have now enjoyed very low gas prices for 6 years. Really, starting in 2008, they were $12 and they fell down to hit $2 in 2012. That's a big windfall for consumers. And what you can see here is a couple of things. Number one is this is the US price down here. And Sarah showed a chart like this. This is what the rest of the world is paying for their gas, from 11 to about 16 bucks. Okay? We're paying around 4 now. What that's doing is that there's a delayed reaction to that, which is leading to very high demand growth for the rest of the decade, we think. Okay? So consumers are reacting to low prices, and they're reacting in 3 ways. First, one, we feel better about substituting substituting gas for coal. This is a look at coal retirements in these green bars. You can see the impact of the MATS regulation, which will take effect next April. And you can see we're going to retire a whole bunch of coal. And that will be largely filled by gas, because gas is what's available right now in terms of capacity. So we're substituting away from coal with gas. Also on the industrial side, you all don't live on the Gulf Coast, Texas and Louisiana Gulf Coast, but the amount of petrochemical plants that are coming on is enormous. We are now exporting bulk commoditized petrochemicals to China. We're sending chemicals to China, okay? Because they're so cheap because of the natural gas. And you can see industrial demand in general is actually picking up quite strongly. And the other thing is we're going to start exporting natural gas in 2 ways. Number one, actually we've been exporting to Mexico on a rapidly rising basis now for a couple of years. And then we have the LNG plants coming up. As the ambassador noted, they will be coming up. They're not going to satisfy global demand, but you have some big numbers coming up in terms of new volumes that will be liquefied here and sent to other countries, mostly to Asia. So, just to recap, the main points I want to leave you with are, this is a big deal because we have tapped in extremely large resources. It only happened because of ingenuity and some high prices that incentivize people to go for it. Okay? Number 2, it's not really much of a revolution anymore. Okay? At some point you have to stop calling something a revolution. This is fairly standard. About 90% of the new source volumes we bring on this year will be shale or unconventional tight oil. Okay? We've been doing it for a while. The major plays have now matured. And then within those plays, remember the things that we covered there. Sweet spots are small, usually less than 4 or 5%. Okay? Most of the acreage will be substantially less good. We drill up the best acreage first, and then we migrate to lower quality areas, right? So it's going to be enormous, but it won't all be fabulous. And then for consumers, we think demand's accelerating, right? We think consumers are getting a great break out of this. U.S. competitiveness is quite strong, and we think will remain strong because we think that under $6, let's say, which is not too far from where we are now, there is an enormous amount of gas. So even if you have to migrate to less good areas, the number of X's on the map is extremely large. And the U.S. should be able to continue to produce a comparative advantage for energy-intensive industries, and particularly for natural gas, for several decades.
Thank you, Raoul. Our next speaker and commentator from this panel is our very own Tim Lieuwen. Tim is a professor of aerospace engineering, as well as currently he's the director of the Strategic Energy Institute, which is one of the integrators on campus on energy-related issues. Tim is a recognized authority on clean energy, and particularly with respect to low energy combustion and power plant monitoring technologies. He's written a number of books. He's actually transitioned some of his labs into lucrative commercial ventures. And he has just returned from a trip to Brazil with Mayor Reed that shows that engineers and policymakers can, in fact, work together. So Tim is here to talk a little bit about how some of those global and national issues that were just raised resonate here in the gas industry in the Southeast.
All right, thank you. So I'd like to thank you, Senator Nunn and Mr. Bankoff and Professor Stulberg for having me here. And what I want to talk about here is just really drill down on the Southeast. And many of the points I'm going to make are similar to Raoul, but I'm going to just kind of emphasize some of the geographic part of this. And really what we're seeing happen, if we want to talk about how natural gas is influencing this region, we need to drill down a little bit. In particular, I find it convenient to look at impacts on manufacturing, power generation mix, transportation, exports, and chemical feedstocks. Because these are this cheap gas and as well as cheap oil and some other cheap gas derivatives impact all of these in different ways. And I want to emphasize a point that Sarah made, which is that it's actually, although it may not be a revolution anymore, it's still very soon, in the sense that all of these things are interacting in a complex ecosystem. And the equilibrium that we had and the different arbitrages that were out there has been radically shifted. And we're just now seeing a lot of these we're seeing new arbitrage opportunities, and we're just seeing some things move around. So that's what I really want to emphasize here. So we can start with a graphic like this, which there's been a couple similar plots to this. This is time, and this is what I'm trying to do here is plot energy prices for coal in green, natural gas in blue, and oil in red. And these are averaged over a year to get rid of some of the bounces. And it's to try to do an apples-to-apples comparison. This is price per million BTUs. So, the first story is clearly the big drop in price of natural gas. There was actually a spike here, which was due to the large coming on of new natural gas-fired power plants. But overall, this drop in price of natural gas is clearly why we're all here today. And one of the first things it's doing is, as you can see, that as the price of natural gas has dropped, in fact, if you look month over month, you'll see some interesting supply dynamics between the price of gas and coal. But you're seeing a significant shift in the power generation mix. For example, in our region, the Southern Company, as part of their integrated resource plan, has talked about a number of coal plant retirements, partially driven by new environmental regulations, but also just driven by cost pressures. And but also as part of this, we're seeing a lot of new natural gas-fired power generation. But again, I want to emphasize that this thing is very dynamic, because in 2013, the amount of natural gas used for power generation actually dropped relative to 2012, just as prices went up. So that's a point that's sometimes not talked about. The other part about this is the transportation sector. So if you look at oil here, you look at natural gas there, this spread is driving lots of interest in some arbitrage in the transportation sector. And it's important to realize that in this country, our transportation sector and our power generation heavy industrial sectors are largely decoupled. Not completely, but they're largely decoupled. We really have almost two energy economies. We have a transportation which largely uses petroleum, and then we have a power generation which is nuclear, coal, natural gas, and things like that. But what's happening is this is really driving some increasing looks at some coupling of these markets. And we're already seeing this in the shipping industry, where utilization of LNG rather than bunker oil or something like that. Lots of interest in the rail industry, the long-haul trucking, for using this much lower price feedstock. So the let's see, which one am I looking at here? The other part, so Tom is going to be talking more about manufacturing, but I just wanted to say a couple words about manufacturing and highlight it. And I'm really trying to focus here on southeastern trends, but I wanted to highlight a couple interesting trends that we're seeing in terms of manufacturing impacts on the southeast. And I wanted to talk about what's happening in the gas turbine industry. So gas turbines are one of the dominant sources of new electrical power generation capacity going forward. They have been for the last several decades. And what's been interesting to see is that the top 4 manufacturers have established major presence, spending about $1 billion total in capacity over the last 5 years in new capacity. And so what we're seeing is that the power plants which are going to utilize natural gas around the world a significant percentage of them will actually be manufactured in our region. And just to show this, I have this animation here. So Greenville, this is General Electric. Has the largest market share. They've been there for a while. There's about 5,000 people. But they really doubled down. You know, in 2012, they spent $170 million on a major testing facility so that they could actually do a full-up testing of a gas turbine. Siemens, so previously they were Westinghouse. They've been in Orlando also for a while. They have about 1,800 people. But more recently, in fact, President Obama referred to this in one of his campaign speeches. They closed a plant in Canada and relocated the manufacturing facility in Charlotte, also for manufacturing these large power plants. Alstom, 2010, in fact, they actually just rolled out their first gas turbine about a year ago. You know, they spent about $300 million in Chattanooga. And then MHI in our own state, near Savannah, spent about $325 million making gas turbines. Now, certainly want to emphasize that I think all of these manufacturers, sales have been quite flat just for a number of reasons, but I think the trend that is very clear over the next 2 decades, we're going to see a lot of things manufactured in our region utilizing natural gas. Another point that I want to make, and this kind of foreshadows the whole next session, which is emphasizing this energy IT intersection. And I want to talk about power plant monitoring, which is that as you have these very, very large, expensive assets distributed around the world, and particularly as sales have been flat, the manufacturers, one of their key growth businesses has been in services. So they have these fleets with thousands of sensors streaming in, so they're very interested in making sure that they understand health of these systems, that they're catching potential problems before they occur, that they optimize replacements and outages, and that they optimize overall fleet management. And what we're seeing is happen, that these sites that are doing this is also happening in our region. So for example, this is a quick animation of some major monitoring centers by the manufacturers. So General Electric, actually in Marietta, just 10 miles from here, has one of the largest facilities in the world where they're tracking about 1,200 different power plants around the world, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. They also have a facility where they're monitoring about 400 peakers in Houston. Siemens in Orlando, Mitsubishi also in Orlando, Alstom in Jupiter, Florida. And then, but also another interesting trend is just seeing how many of the larger utilities are increasingly scaling up their presence in this space. You know, it's a really interesting overlay of this big data revolution and industrial internet with heavy duty power plants. So that's one trend I want to highlight. So LNG exports. So just moving down this list, just say a few things about LNG exports. The prior speakers have already mentioned this arbitrage between prices in the United States. So this is the U.S. gas prices. Asia's way up here. Well, now it takes a certain amount of money to ship natural gas. So take these prices, add $3, $5, $7, depending on where you're going to go. But it's still well below these numbers. And so there's a big drive for exporting natural gas. And this is an overlay from the DOE website of where these sites are going to be occurring. And so what this is labeled by the orange here is the approved sites. These are approved for exporting to non-free trade agreements sites. And then the blue is pending. All this export capacity, it's not going to come online, but we're certainly going to see a significant increase, and it's going to be concentrated in the Gulf Coast, in Louisiana and Texas. Georgia, we have a small export facility which has been approved for free trade, exporting to free trade nations. This is at Elba Island. And then the last thing I want to emphasize is chemical feedstocks. Now, this is related to manufacturing, but I want to differentiate it because as opposed to talking about natural gas as the source of energy here, the chemical feedstocks are actually the molecules, the atoms that make chemicals. And again, this is just some interesting new arbitrage opportunities. So we've talked about gas, we've talked about oil, but it's important to realize there's this whole other big dynamic going on, which is that with this natural gas, there's a lot of other stuff, what we call natural gas liquids, ethane, propane, and other chemicals, which are valuable. So this is a plot of this bottom line here is the price of natural gas. This top is the price of oil. This middle line here is the price of ethane. All right, so ethane is an important feedstock for making plastics, for instance. And what you can see is it looks like it's pretty much priced on an energy basis to the price of oil up till about 6 years ago, and then you see it moving away, and now you see the price of ethane basically approaching that of natural gas. Well, what's that doing? Well, again, we talked about this. The chemicals industry, it's a big business. It's about a $770 billion industry. It actually made up about 12% of our overall exports. And both low-cost natural gas as a direct feedstock for things like fertilizer and so forth, but also these natural gas liquids, the ethane, the propane, and things like that. What that's done is it's enabled the United States to be the low-cost producer. Raoul mentioned how we're exporting stuff to China and all over, and this is a nice little map just showing where these announced and anticipated new chemical plants are happening. Again, very strong concentration on the Gulf Coast, but you're also seeing some other geographic distribution, including in Tennessee. So just to wrap up my point here, so this with low natural gas prices and all these new arbitrage opportunities, certainly big impacts on the Southeast, significant state-to-state variations, but also just want to emphasize the newness of this as we see some of the different arbitrage opportunities interacting with each other. And in particular, if we could start seeing a stronger coupling of natural gas for a power generation source and a transportation source, that would really have significant impacts going forward. So thank you.
Thanks, Tim. Our next speaker is also a Georgia Tech faculty member. It's our own Tom Kurfess. Tom is a professor and distinguished chair in fluid power and motion control at the Woodruff School of Mechanical Engineering here at Georgia Tech. And in addition to his fine scholarly credentials that are outlined in your program, Tom also served as Assistant Director for Advanced Manufacturing at the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the Executive Office of the President of the United States. So again, another exemplar of our faculty on the engineering side working on policy issues. And Tom's going to talk about and pick up some of the points that Tim mentioned about what's going on in the manufacturing sector here in the Southeast due to this gas boom.
Good. Thank you, Adam. So, good morning, everybody, and I will wrap this up, but sort of starting off where we were looking at out of the Advanced Manufacturing Partnership Steering Committee. So these are recommendations. You can go to whitehouse.gov, not whitehouse.com, right? And identify, there are 16 recommendations for action, but sort of there are 3 key areas. And I'm really going to focus on the first 2, and that's enabling innovation. So the idea really is there are new ideas, you have to get them out, you have to get them into production, before the competition does. And those new ideas continue to evolve over time. And this, of course, is something that we've been very, very good at in the United States. The other one is securing the talent pipeline. That's basically to say, well, how do you get these new innovations out there? How do you make use of this new technology and get it out to the population? And of course, this is where a lot of the education, by the way, not only of the next generation workforce, but our current generation workforce is really important. And of course, we've been hearing a lot about the business climate and so forth. And in particular, one of the focus areas was energy policy. But I won't hit on that one in particular. But one of the things we look at, all right, is people say, well, yes, this new energy and so forth, and we're still not looking at what's it going to do to energy efficiency and so forth. I can tell you, and I work closely with a number of the companies that Tim highlighted over there in terms of new materials and so forth. So this whole new energy boom, the lower gas prices and so forth are moving us forward in terms of new energy. So people are now focusing on these things and so forth. What you're seeing there actually is a stator. It's actually machining in one of our labs, a stator of a gas turbine. It's quite big. It's a single crystal. And in many of these instances, these materials are operating above their melting temperatures. So this is sort of an interesting concept, right? How can you build something that operates above its own melting temperature, right? So again, thinking outside of the box, not only in terms of the actual material, but what you might go about using it and so forth. I am coming out of automotive sector, so one of the things that we're looking at in terms of production, is we do have various types of vehicles out there and their power. If you would have asked me 20 years ago, what will a car look like? I would have told you internal combustion engine, pneumatic tires, front wheel, maybe rear wheel drive, and that would have been it. So, if you take a look at what's going to happen 20 years from now, it will be a wide variety. It's not going to be only a plug-in electric. It's not going to be a hybrid or natural gas powered. It's going to be a combination of those. So what does that mean? That basically means in terms of manufacturing, we have to increase our flexibility, for production. And again, a lot of times people don't think about the United States as a significant powerhouse, in terms of automotive. We are, and by the way, a lot of other companies are investing. Right? So if you see an X5, X6, or X3 anywhere in the world from BMW, it came from the United States. If you drive a Nissan in Japan, odds are the engine came from the United States, as well as the powertrain from Tennessee. I think we probably just recently we read that Honda is now exporting more cars from the United States than importing, right? So these are the types of things that are going on. And that change is happening. And by the way, it's not only happening in terms of the technology, but all the way down in terms of our lives, in terms of things like building codes and so forth that we look at. So if you look at where do you have 240 volts, right, in your house, you have it in the laundry room, and you have it in the kitchen, right, to drive your dryer and to drive your stove and your oven. Right? Where don't we have it? We don't have it in our garage for our plug-in hybrids, but those standards are going to be changing. But again, really completely rethinking, how we move forward and so forth in terms of the nation. In terms of what that means for us, for training, and by the way, it's great in terms of a university, but this really goes through the entire K through 12 and undergraduate and graduate. I mean, there's no doubt about it in terms of how we need to be thinking. Okay, from a manufacturing perspective, how we use our new tools, how we leverage that energy, okay, but also the continuing education, okay, and the distributed and distance learning. The other thing we're looking at is, executive education. I can tell you, even though we're looking at lower cost energy, typical plant targets for production operations are 8% reduction in energy consumption on an annual basis, okay. Why is that? Well, it's good for the environment, it's sustainable, and so forth. Well, the other thing, though, if you use less energy, guess what? Your costs go down, no matter how low the cost of energy. Now, it's very clear, if you have lower energy costs, that is not going to be as much of an impetus to move things forward, okay? But it will happen. We saw a lot of charts about energy prices going up and down. So one of the things we like to see in operations, basically, is reducing our sensitivity, right, to those variabilities. Right, so if you want to desensitize yourself to energy fluctuations, what do? You reduce the amount of energy that you're consuming. You make yourself more robust. And by the way, you start to take a look at different sources of energy so that you could move over. All right? If you take a look at the plant, BMW's plant up in South Carolina, for example, they use actually a lot of gas out of the landfill, so the methane type of gas. That's a win-win. As opposed to flaring off the methane from the landfill, they're actually burning it. Okay, but it's not quite so easy. In fact, where you use it the most is in the paint shop when you dry the paint, when you cure the paint on the vehicle or any of the different layers on the vehicle. But burning methane versus burning natural gas, two completely different operations. So you have to be very careful how you put those together. And you can't rely on one or the other because again, they're also backup sources. But it's a win-win scenario. And also taking a look at the concept of lifelong learning, because I can tell you what we see today will be very different from what we see tomorrow in 5 or 10 years down the road. Again, I go back to the car. You're in the workforce for 40 years. Think about maybe 50 years. I don't know, depends on how things go with Social Security. That's another discussion, right? But think about the car 40 or 50 years ago and how different it is today. And that technology rate is accelerating. That change is accelerating, okay? So if we even take a look at the telephone, right? What do we do with a telephone? We dial a telephone, right? Why do we dial it? My kids, why do we dial it out? Because we used to have a dial on it, right, and so forth. So we don't even think about many of those types of things, along those lines. In terms of sort of putting the mission together, I mean, clearly it is about job growth. I mean, this is what lights people up. But basically, what we saw, in terms of the administration, and really what we see across the nation, you've got the research, you've got the education, they come together to drive that innovation, okay? And then you go back down, and it is about putting teams together, okay? So having the right teams, the complements, of the industries. By the way, the big industries, the small and the medium-sized industries, and then applying it, and not just about the fundamental research, but really moving it out. So a lot of what you've seen in terms of the types of research that's going on, we see that industry is accelerating that innovation into the marketplace fairly rapidly. So in terms of the big picture, right, I mean, what it is in terms of, energy does in terms of, manufacturing, right, it is about wealth creation. We know that. We're making things, and we see that growing within the United States. And in particular, as Tim mentioned, the chemical sector, which is very exciting. But it is also about enabling the small and medium-sized enterprises. With the lower cost energy is doing quite well. Sustainability and efficiency, they're good for the environment, but they also make, serious dollars. We do have a new workforce foundation. This is one of these things, like, well, kids don't know how to change oil in cars anymore and so forth. Well, okay, we need to live with that as opposed to going back to teach them. Most cars, well, many cars, and it's going that way, will not have dipsticks in them. It's almost like in the 1930s saying, well, these kids don't know how to put a shoe on a horse. Was that important? So rethinking it. So, and one of the things actually in terms of seeing the people here today, it is important to get the technical people out there. So I spend some time in Washington and so forth. If you have an opportunity to get out, and make a difference on the technology side, go do it. If you're an administrator and so forth, and you can send somebody with some technical expertise to help and to move the policy forward, please do that, because technology is really what's going to be driving the future. So in terms of the United States, what this energy is allowing us to do, it's enabling our innovation, which we're very strong at culturally. And also, it's allowing us to move that talent pipeline forward, and we need to continue to do that. And by the way, not only is it good for the United States, right, but sort of the manufacturing, and whether it's in the United States and you have manufacturing elsewhere as it spills over, it's good around the world from a security perspective, because if people are making things and they're making money and they have good jobs, typically they tend to be very happy, and that keeps their hands from being idle. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. So at this point, I'd like to invite you guys to participate in this discussion. So are there any questions? Panels, we've covered a lot. Back in the very back there. And since, as was mentioned earlier, the microphone goes into the computer feed, so please speak up.
Thank you very much. I get the message that you're telling us that this seems to be a real boon for the United States and possibly for the world. But the question that keeps popping up in my head is, how temporary might this be? Because I can see these technologies of fracking and horizontal drilling being applied to many other places around the world. And I'm just wondering, are they going to very soon catch up to us in terms of having that capability and increasing their production, reducing their costs, so that our advantage goes away?
Sarah, do you want to take a first crack at how replicable this is?
Sure, yeah, and I'm sure other people have some thoughts too. We actually get that question a lot from other countries who seek to pursue, their resources, right? So the Energy Information Administration pointed out in their shale gas resource study, the United States doesn't have the most shale gas resources. We're fourth on the list, right? And we're not first on the list for tight oil either. And so it does sort of, make this point that these resources exist elsewhere. And so, folks usually ask us, gee, how do we replicate the U.S. experience? And there's sort of a serious and a non-serious answer to that question. The first one is, do you want to? There's a very active dialogue about how unconventional gases and tight oil is produced in this country, and whether it's appropriately regulated, and how safe it is, and what kind of impacts it's having on societies and local communities. And I'm not taking a side in that debate, but it's a very active one, and it's one that, at different points in time, we've been fairly concerned that it would be disruptive to sort of the production of this resource. And so a lot of other countries are saying, well, gee, maybe what we'll do is take a look at your regulatory experience, take a look at, sort of the learning curve that you have gone through for a very short period of time about these technologies, and assess, what makes sense for sort of our environment. Now, all that being said, one of the very unique things about the United States is, 95% of this is happening on private lands, right? That's not happening in other places around the world. Some other places around the world, the government, the central government or local government own the resource base. And so it's a different kind of social negotiation over what kind of costs and or burdens local communities are willing to bear to be able to bring those resources to bear. We also have a huge number of folks in this country that can and like to drill holes in the ground. I think it's something like, Raoul can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's something like, I think 30 companies own 50% of the natural gas reserves in the country, and the other 50% are owned by like 1,000 companies. I mean, we just
10,000.
10,000, right? So like, we have this huge industry, and tons of pipelines, and tons of and a very permissive sort of regulatory and market structure. And oh, by the way, we had $13 gas that sort of allowed all of this to happen. And so I don't follow it probably to the degree that Raoul and his colleagues do on a sort of a well-by-well basis elsewhere. What we do know so far is some of the rocks elsewhere look a little bit more complicated. Every country has sort of a different subset of challenges that will complicate their ability to sort of, produce as much of the resource as the resource potential would make you think is there. But it could be significant for a number of countries and not look like the experience we've had here. It could take longer, it could be slower, but it could still be significant for some other countries. And so from a geopolitical landscape, the thing that's really hard to assess is, part of what's really given us a boost, aside from all the hard economic, factors that you can take into account from what we've gotten from this, is sort of the psychological one. We were in a roundtable about sort of what the impact of the geopolitical impact of shale and oil gas, oil revolution in the United States was for countries like China. And someone said, it has sort of dampened the U.S. in decline narrative among some schools of thinking within sort of, Chinese policymaking. And I was like, why? Well, there was a narrative after the economic crisis that the United States was really sort of on its last legs. And in a way, this sort of proved to some people, don't take the U.S. for granted. They can innovate themselves out of a whole bunch of different things in very surprising ways. And I thought that was just, you can't quantify that, but that's kind of an interesting aside from the geopolitical realm. But I don't know if you want to...
Raoul, do you have something?
Yeah, I would just say, in my mind, in the long term, it's inevitable. There's valuable resources in the ground. But the way that I would put it is, there's not going to be meaningful production in a meaningful time frame. All right, and meaningful for us, I'm thinking the next 10 years. And the best way that I put it is, the reason that it has taken off in the U.S. and Canada is that there is a set of circumstances, a sort of ecosystem, okay? And in the same way, you can't say you've got a wonderful pineapple farm in Hawaii, you can't say, we're going to take it to Canada and ramp this thing up, because they've got a lot of land, okay? You're not, okay? Because there are elements that are there that you may be taking for granted. So the point is, actually, when we look at countries, and we use a traffic light system, there are some countries that are kind of yellow, but most of them are in the red category, because they don't have the 7 or 8 big ingredients, okay, that we feel are necessary to get there quickly. Now, I agree with Sarah. They may invent their own way, okay? And I think they can, okay? But that's going to take a long time. And in the same way, think of it this way. You have Silicon Valley, which works fabulously. How many states and how many other countries have said, we're going to create another Silicon Valley? And it's really hard to do. It's not just a matter of building some buildings and having a lot of smart people, right? They have to interact in ways, they have to be supported by other institutions and factors and all sorts of things that build this little ecosystem that make this thing hum. And in the US, those factors are generally there. It's sort of the perfect laboratory for innovation, actually, for a number of reasons I won't go into because it takes too long. But and we, like I say, we have innovated our way to something that's pretty big.
Tom, do you want to add something?
Yeah, so just from an industrial perspective, you take other guys who say, well, if you could scale it up, right, we've already in the United States have significant industrial capability, right, and also the workforce and training and so forth. So this allows rapid scale up. The next thing is stability. yes, if other parts of the world do build it up, do you really want to invest and put your plants down in those areas? And then the other thing, actually, one of my colleagues mentioned the other day is just the pipelines. So yes, if they were getting all this gas in China, how would they get it out? How would they distribute it, and so forth? So I think following along on Raoul's point is it's very hard to do, and we are in an excellent position to leverage this.
We have a question there.
Hi, this is a question for Mr. Ambassador. It's specifically about the region, but I want to know your viewpoint about other parts of the world also, because you were talking about the stability. And so this pipeline that you mentioned, Southern Corridor, and from your map, you kind of excluded Armenia, and because of the dispute between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Do you think sometime in the future, maybe by including Armenia into this kind of project, you can help in the stability of the region, and having these two countries after years of standoff actually coming together and work toward a certain goal together? And the second question is about Iran. Recently, the president of Azerbaijan visited Iran, and there were some rumors about Azerbaijan being a source for Iran to exporting its natural gas to Europe. Can you comment on that also? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Well, I did not exclude Armenia since I did not draw the line of the pipeline. I know you used it, but Excellency, in my opinion, it's a little bit over exaggerated. I don't make those decisions. I need to make sure. But in general, these pipelines, all the pipelines, oil pipelines and gas pipelines, have contributed enormously to the prosperity of the region. As I mentioned, for instance, Azerbaijan today is the largest investor in Georgia, largest taxpayer. Georgian prosperity, the state, the Republic of Georgia, is directly linked to this, to both pipeline projects. In fact, the Southern Corridor investment of $2 billion into Georgia would be the single largest investment. Azerbaijan is rapidly becoming the largest investor in Turkey, which is a major economy, so you understand that there's a great growth there. Now, the goal of the energy project is to deliver product to the market in a safe and productive and economic way. So the issue is not to make Armenia happy. The issue is to make money while selling a good product. And that's why I think that is the main calculation. If there was a discussion about possibility of Armenia being included, if there is no conflict with Azerbaijan, of course, if Armenia is a safe and a part of the region, that would be a good thing. In fact, we have long insisted that Armenia, by imposing its own self-isolation, by occupying Azerbaijan internationally recognized territory, has put itself into that situation. Now, however, we have to be careful with this, because it is only, and as so many experts here on at the panel know, it's easy to draw the line, and often people keep asking me, why doesn't pipeline go there? Why doesn't the road come here? I said, well, because as someone who grew up in a country which produces oil, it's difficult to build a pipeline. You have to negotiate terrain, you have to talk to people, you have to regulatory regimes, you need to know where this, with the security issues. So this is not an easy process. Even if we want to do something today, it's not that easy to do. In fact, of course, there are other issues that, for instance, the foreign military bases of the Russian Federation on the territory of Armenia, and we generally prefer to deal with the countries which act independently and don't act as something which belongs to another country. So that having said that, also adds to a question on Iran. There's clearly some warming up between the international community and Iran. And Iran is a major producer of natural gas and oil. So, of course, that reserve is there. Azerbaijan is not in a position to make decisions when Iran can become a full-fledged member of the international energy producing community. The question there is, again, twofold. One is a political climate. And of course, if the sanctions are lifted, if the international community wants to do, I mean, major investors are Western companies, so if they're ready to go, we're not going to prevent them from doing that. However, That too is a theoretical question until you actually negotiate an agreement. I mean, Iran is also a producer country. It also has its own regulations. It has its own pipelines. It's not as easy. But of course, the very fact that Iran holds enormous reserves provides an alternative, potential alternative resource. And if in the future things work out between the Western nations and Iran, that could be a good incentive to move forward.
Thank you. Well, at this point, why don't we go ahead and take a few-minute break while we rearrange the decks here a little bit, and we'll welcome you back in about 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.